Yeah.
Okay. Parshas Chayei talks about the death of Sarah Imenu, the first matriarch of the Jewish people, and about Avram negotiating with Ephron and the Bnei Ches to acquire the Moras HaMachpelah and the field that the Moras HaMachpelah is in as a burial site for Sarah Imenu. And the Moras HaMachpelah was not just a burial site for Sarah Imenu, but as it's mentioned in Parshas Vayechi, it was the burial site for Abraham himself, Yitzchak and Rivka, Yaakov and Leah. And that's what's mentioned in the Torah itself. However, our sages tell us that there was a fourth couple that was buried there prior to when the patriarchs and matriarchs were buried there. And that was Adam and Chava. Adam, the first man, Chava, the first lady, and first in the sense of being created first, nothing to do with Washington, D.C. And the Pirkei, the Rabbi Lezer says that that's the reason. Rashi brings it down. That's the reason, or one of the reasons, I should say, that Hebron, the area where the Moras Machpelah was called Kiryat Arba because of the four couples that were buried there. But it's very interesting that in the Torah Shebechsav, reference is only made regarding the matriarchs and the patriarchs, whereas in the Torah Shebal Peh, in the Medrash, in the oral tradition that was later written down, it mentions not just Avram and Sarah, Yitzchak and Rivka, Yaakov and Leah, but it also mentions Adam and Chava. Why is it that in the oral tradition it's given over one way, and in the written tradition it's given over another way? Now, the Ibn Ezra, in discussing what the significance of the Abraham's negotiation, and the Torah attributes a lot of space, a lot of words, a lot of verses to the discussion that took place, the negotiations that took place between Avram and the Bnei Ches, the people of Ches, who were the prior owners to the Moras HaMachpelah and to the area in which the Moras HaMachpelah was. So why is it that there's so much mention about it? We don't find that so much in regard to Yitzchak, a little bit of reference. Yaakov, there's mention because in regard to Yaakov, they had to take his coffin, they had to take it from Egypt to Eretz Yisrael for burial. But let's say about Leah, there isn't even an explicit reference. And Rivka, there isn't an explicit, there is a Shama Kavarti. Yaakov says, I buried Leah there, and he makes mention to the fact that Yitzchak buried Rivka there. But there is, in regard to the other avos, the patriarchs and matriarchs, regarding the burial, very little is mentioned. So Ibn Ezra explains that one reason is, he says there are two reasons for it. One reason is the Torah wants to tell us, to let us know, the skula, okay, this only applies to the first, the skula about that there is the merit. Well, skula is somewhat of a little difficult word to translate into English, but the merit, the credit of the merit, I guess, that a person gets from for living and dying in Eretz Yisrael. In other words, it's not only significant to live in Eretz Yisrael, but even burial in Eretz Yisrael. I shouldn't say dying. Burial in Eretz Yisrael is also of significance. It's a great merit. It's identified. The Gemara in Ksuvos talks about it. That like it's like being buried by the mizbeach, by the altar. So, and then he gives now. And then the Ibn Ezra gives another answer, and the other answer is it was to show that to a certain degree there was a fulfillment of the commitment that Hakadosh Baruch Hu, that God gave Avram to Avram, that he will own Eretz Yisrael. In other words, the way Mefarshim understand the Ibn Ezra. In other words, here Avram actually acquires part of Eretz Yisrael. At that point, he really did not own any parts of Eretz Yisrael. So here there was a partial fulfillment of the haftacha, of the commitment. Now, there are two questions asked against the answers of the Ibn Ezra, the explanation of the Ibn Ezra. The first question against the first explanation, in other words, the Torah is trying to emphasize that there is a special skula, a special merit, not only in living in Eretz Yisrael. We know that because there's a mitzvah, v'yirashtem esaretz v'yashavtem ba, there's a mitzvah living in Eretz Yisrael. According to the Ramban, the mitzvah of living Eretz Yisrael is a required mitzvah. The Ramban counts it as one of the 613 mitzvos. And even according to the Rambam, who doesn't count it as one of the mitzvahs, I mentioned what I heard from my father. It's a mitzvah kiyumis, and it's not a required mitzvah under normal circumstances, but there is certainly a fulfillment of a mitzvah. And the Sifri says, "Shkula mitzvahs yishav Eretz Yisrael keneged kol haTorah kula," that the fulfillment of living in Eretz Yisrael is equated in certain manners, like the observance of the whole Torah. But even in regard to the dead being buried in Eretz Yisrael, there is a special merit. This is, but so the question, the Ramban, I think, asked the question against Ibn Ezra. If Sarah had died in Egypt in the manner that Yaakov did, and let me just shut off my phone. If Sarah had died in Egypt and was was taken to, and her body was taken to Eretz Yisrael for burial, then it would show the significance of burial in Eretz Yisrael. But Sarah died in Eretz Yisrael. The natural place to have buried her would have been in the place she died. So by telling us that Avram acquired a burial spot in Eretz Yisrael for her, how does that show us that there is a special merit in being buried in Eretz Yisrael? That Eretz Yisrael is a skula, l'chayim u'lamesim. It's a special merit, both for the living and for the dead who are buried there. So, now the truth is, I think that we could accept the Ibn Ezra's teretz explanation in spite of the Ramban's question, but we have to add one point to it. And that is, it's not from the fact that Avram buried her in Eretz Yisrael that we see that Eretz Yisrael has a special merit, not only for the living, but for the dead as well. But it's from the fact that the Torah emphasizes, talks so much about it. Also in this week's Sedra, when Eliezer goes to get a wife from Yitzchak, and he goes and talks to Psuel and to Lavan and to the members of Rivka's family about the prospect of Rivka going back to Eretz Canaan and to become the wife of Yitzchak. And the Torah goes into great detail about the negotiations or the talk that went on between Eliezer, the servant of Avram, and Psuel and Rivka's family. So the Medrash says, look, there are so many halachas, so many laws that are deduced from one little extra letter in some words of the Torah. And here we see a discussion between Eliezer and Rivka's family, and it goes into detail over and over and over again. And the Medrash says, Yafa sichasen shel avdei yavos, yoser meitarasen shel banim. It appears that the sicha, the talk, the discussion of the servants of Avram is given more importance than the Torah, the halachas that were given over to the descendants of the Avos, to the descendants of the patriarchs and matriarchs. In other words, there are certain things that, if we're given a law, that is sufficient. But there are certain traits, very often has to do with character traits, but it could be in other areas as well, that to give it over properly, it has to be given over from generation to generation by example. There are certain things that just can't be given over by words alone. And in a sense, the Torah keeps the events alive in order that we should learn from the example. And this is part of the Masorah of generation to generation. And very interesting, I was told by somebody who was related to the family of the Chavetz Chaim that the Chavetz Chaim would stand up whenever the Shamash of Reb Chaim, my great-grandfather, would walk in. I don't know. I didn't hear that the Chavetz Chaim would stand up for all the Talmidim. Reb Chaim had great Talmidim. I'm not talking about just the outstanding Talmidim, those who were the leaders of the Torah world, like Reb Baruch Ber, like Rav Salma Meltzer. But I'm talking about the other Talmidim were also very, very great. They became the leading Rosh Hashivas, the leading Rabbanim. I didn't hear. It's possible that the Chavetz Chaim did. But for the Shamash was a person who took care of the needs of Reb Chaim. He would stand up. And I think that perhaps we could understand it. The Talmidim were able to repeat the Shiurim of Reb Chaim. And they were able to tell things over about Reb Chaim. But the Shamash, because of his involvement, not just daily, but constantly throughout the days. And the Shamash was probably not a great Lamdan, not a great Talmid Chacham, probably a person who needed to make a living. But he was able to give over things about Reb Chaim that the others could not give over in the same degree, because they didn't experience it as much as he experienced it. I remember years ago when my father came to Chicago. In New York, this would not have happened at that time. And my father gave a shiur, and the shiur dealt with how Reb Chaim acted Erev Yom Kippur in terms of asking people for mechila who really were not deserving of mechila. And my father gave a whole shiur explaining it al pi halacha. And I remember those who attended that shiur, that was something that they weren't exposed to before. They were used to shiurim that had a kasha from the Gemara and the Rambam, a stira in the Rambam, but a whole shiur explaining why Reb Chaim acted in a certain way to ask mechila. And they didn't understand it. They just didn't understand it. Afterwards, they were puzzled. And the expression was, that's just what Reb Chaim did. They didn't understand the concept of Masorah. Masorah, it's not their fault. Masorah is not just something that's read from a page. It's something that's experienced. What Reb Chaim did was as much Torah as the Chiddushei Rabbeinu Chaim Halevi. Today, people have a greater understanding of this type of thing. So, in a sense, that's Gadol Sichas, Yafa Sichasan, Shel Avdei Yavos, Yosem Torah Shel Bam Eliezer. It was an Eved, okay, it was Moshe, but he had exposure. And the Torah wanted to keep that experience alive. It was very important. So the Torah goes into detail about it. And in a sense, that's the idea here also. The Torah here, by telling over every detail, is telling us that this was very important. It wasn't just, it's very important, and the Torah understood that there are certain areas where people understand the significance when they experience it in former generations. So here too, the Torah was telling us that about emphasizing the importance of Avram acquiring land. Of course, he had no choice. He had to acquire land. But the Torah, in detailing it, says this is significant. This is important. So it's the Torah that, it's the fact that it's mentioned at length in the Torah. And the Torah felt that it's important enough not just to know about it, but to, in a sense, experience it in the former generations, in the first of the generations. Because then it would have a greater impact upon us. You know, at least at one time, today that's changed. I might, if we have time, I'll go into that. Because, unfortunately, I see changes taking place in the Jewish community. I'm not talking now about the Orthodox community, but at one time, when it came to death, when it came to mourning, when it came to burial, even those that were not scrupulous in their observance of Torah and mitzvos, they were very careful in doing it in the traditional manner, in the manner that their parents did it and their grandparents did it. The Torah it talks so much about acquiring the land in Eretz Yisrael. And Avram say, Ger v'toshav anochi imachem. I am a ger and a toshav with you, emphasizing his connection to the land of Eretz Yisrael, not just because I am here, in order that that should make an impression upon us. And that's why, that's to indicate that there's a special merit. But I want to, throughout this year, I'm going to discuss what the significance of this special merit is. And then, regarding the second question, the second answer that the Ibn Ezra gives, that is to show the fulfillment of some degree in the commitment given to Avraham Avinu, that Klal Yisrael, that his descendants, and that he and his descendants will be given the land of Israel for eternity. He paid a good price. He bought a burial lot. He bought a cave with a field around it. What is the significance of that in terms of the commitment that God gave him, that his descendants will inherit all of Eretz Yisrael? But again, I think the Torah is emphasizing that now And my uncle, in discussing about the significance of burial in Eretz Yisrael and burials, so he mentioned a something that he was told regarding the Gaul. The Gaul was the leader of the French government, and the Rothschild family was, of course, everybody knows, was from the richest families in Europe, very important, and they were in different countries, but they were in France also. And when Edmund Rothschild died, or afterwards, the family wanted and did move his body to Eretz Yisrael for burial. So Charles de Gaulle, who was no Oev Yisrael, we certainly remember how he turned against the state of Israel after the Six-Day War. He said that he thought that Rothschild was always a good Frenchman, but now he understands that he is mistaken. Why? Who is a good Frenchman? One who is brought up in France, educated in France, whose language is French, who takes up arms to fight for France, and who is buried in France. In other words, to a certain degree, burial, but especially when you choose, as in his case, to be buried somewhere else, you are identifying from an eternal perspective with the land that you choose to be buried. And by the Torah emphasizing and devoting space, I think, this is the way we could understand the Ibn Ezra's explanation. By the Torah emphasizing, by, in a sense, giving us the ability to relive that experience for all future generations. It's not just a historical fact of the past. The Torah is trying to set that as an example for future generations. Why? Because this shows us that the identification, the eternal identification of the Jewish people with Eretz Yisrael. And where do we see it? Because when Avram negotiated with them, they said, "B'michark fareinu kfaras meisecha, nisi elakim atah b'sokeinu." You are a prince of God in our midst. They wanted to be identified with Avram, and they wanted Avram identified with them. And in a certain sense, this is very similar to the concern that Avram and that Yaakov and Yosef had regarding the burial of Yaakov. That Paro will not look favorably because they wanted to identify with Yaakov. So Paro would not look favorably upon the Yosef insisting, which he did, on burying Yaakov in Eretz Yisrael, because when you choose to be buried in a certain land, so you are saying, you're saying, I'm identifying with that land. But Avram when he chose the Ma'aras HaMachpelah, he did not want Sarah or any one of the patriarchs or matriarchs to be buried b'mivchak varenu, as they offered him in the best of the graves, in the most prominent graveyards of the Bnei Ches. No, we want to be completely separate. Because when we want to identify eternally with the land of Israel, we are identifying with the land of Israel as part of the Jewish people. Unfortunately, sometimes when Jews want to identify with Eretz Yisrael, when they seek positions of leadership, it's not important to them that Eretz Yisrael be identified as a Jewish country. Israel allows people of all religions, the state of Israel, allows people of all religions to live there. But a person has to draw a line at a certain point and ask, at what point are we removing Jewish identity from the state? I was told, I don't know if that was true or not, that I was not told this by anybody in my family, that apparently that Herzl had a meeting with Reb Chaim, and Reb Chaim got the impression from Herzl, if this story is true, I don't know, that Herzl wanted a state that will allow for Jews to live there without being discriminated. But he did not necessarily want a state that in its essence was Jewish. Whether the story is true or not, I don't know. But whether it was true then or not, I can't tell you. But without saying it explicitly, we are facing that same challenge today. The state of Israel has to be a Jewish state. It's not enough that it be a state that allows Jews to live there. It's true, it's significant. And when it has to be a Jewish state, it's not only a Jewish state of the Jews of this generation, it's the Jewish state of the Jews of the previous generations. And it's the Jewish state of the Jews of future generations as well. In a sense, all the generations merge when it comes to the land of Israel. Now, so I think Avram's insistence that we do not want your honor to be buried in your most honorable graveyards. We want to be buried as Jews, as a separate people. And we want to identify Eretz Yisrael with the Jewish people from an eternal perspective. Now, it's very interesting. Rashi, at the beginning of Bereshis, and I've discussed this many times, Rashi, at the beginning of Bereshis, says, why is it that the Torah begins with Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim va'aretz? Rashi, it's based on a Medrash Tanchuma. It's not Rashi's own thought. It's a Medrash Tanchuma in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak. So Rashi says, Why does the Torah start off with Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'haaretz? The Torah should have started off. The Torah, after all, is a book of mitzvos, of laws, of requirements, of prohibitions. And the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people as a nation was the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh. HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim. The Torah should start off with HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim. Elakoach Maisav Higid Lamav. Rashi says, but God told his nation the strength of his deeds. Lo seis lahem nachlas goyim, to give them the land of nations. Because the nations of the world will tell the Jewish people, listem atem, you stole the land. It belonged to the 7 nations. Just as today, they're making the false claim that the land belongs to the Palestinians, who never existed as a nation. So Hevi Omer Lahem, you have to tell them, God created the world. God created the land of Israel. It's his. And he gave it to whoever he gave it. And he gave it to us. And the question is, so many questions on the Rashi. What's the question? The way all the commentaries explain Rashi. The question is, the Torah is a book of laws. So what's the answer? That's one thing. And then the Ramban himself says, we certainly are required to believe that God created the world. That God created the world. Why is it that the Torah has to say it in the Torah Shebechsav and at the beginning of the Torah Shebechsav? Before it talks about the mitzvos. And then the question is about the nations of you think the nations of the world, imagine at the UN, the ambassador of, I used to say the ambassador of Saudi Arabia, but I have to be careful now. They might go into the Abraham Accords, but the ambassador of Iran, and I'm sure the UN, in its foolishness and stupidity and anti-Semitic attitude, they recognized the so-called Palestinians nation, and they'll probably have a representative there, and they'll give a whole speech screaming, listem atem, you stole the land. And then the ambassador from Israel will get up with a Chumash Bereshis. Actually, I think Ben Gurion was not exactly your most religious person. When the UN and before the state of Israel was established, sent a committee to investigate about Palestine and about Israel. And they asked them, where is your contract to the land? Ben Gurion pointed to the Tanakh. So even Ben Gurion understood that the land of Eretz Yisrael belonged to the Jewish people. So you think the ambassador from Iran, you think the ambassador from the Palestinians will say, oh, you're right, we made a mistake. Obviously not. And Koch Maisav Higid Lamav, the strength of his deeds, he told his nation. It should say Higid Higid to the Umos Olam. He told the nations of the world. But the answer is, unfortunately, and we see it today, perhaps more than it was seen generations ago, that the Jewish people are influenced by the nations of the world. Look at all these fools, and that's the better ones among them, those that are mentally ill. And the others are just plain Jewish anti-Semites, that they stand up and they side with the Palestinians. They demonstrate against Israel's defending themselves. They forget the lesson of World War II. They become partners of the contemporary Nazis. There's no other way to describe them. And we become so, if we don't answer them back, we have to answer them back. Not that we'll convince them. Not that we'll convince them. And even those who theoretically believe in the Torah won't be convinced. But we have to answer them back, because if we don't answer them back, then ultimately they will have an influence on us. We answer them back not because we will be able to convince them, but we answer them back that they shouldn't convince us of their lies. And not that we really would believe what they say, but the Jewish people suffer from an inferiority complex, a servile attitude. And somehow, slaves very often identify with their masters. And our self-perspective, or those people's self-perspective, they have a very bad self-perspective as a Jew. But if they combine their Jewishness with the anti-Jewish feelings that are the foundation of the murders that are taking place against the Jewish people, the putting of Jewish children in ovens in front of their mothers, the raping of Jewish women, that they don't protest. Oh, to sign at the end of a letter, a whole letter that's run against the Jews. But we are upset with October 7th. So if the Jewish people become partners with the anti-Semites, so therefore the Torah writes this, that we should answer them. But the question is, we could answer them with the Torah Shebaal Peh. A number of answers we could give. First of all, unfortunately, throughout the generations, how many Jews knew the Torah Shebaal Peh, especially even observant Jews? There were certain limitations when it was an oral tradition. Those that were involved in learning certainly knew about it, knew in detail. But more than that, the Torah Shebechasav, there's a difference between the Torah Shebechasav and the Torah Shebaal Peh. The Torah Shebechasav is open for everybody to see. To a certain degree, from the perspective of Torah Shebechasav, You don't even need a Masorah. You can go to the library. And you could take out a Chumash. You can take out a Bible. You can take out an English translation. Torah Shebaal Peh originally was completely hidden. It's interesting. There's discussion among the Mefarshim. You're not allowed to teach Torah to non-Jews. What the reason is discussed. And some say it only applies to the Torah Shebaal Peh. But in the Torah Shebechsav, that's open for the whole world to see. So I want to suggest that that's the reason. In other words, it's put before first of all, it is a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah for when we fight for Eretz Yisrael, when we defend Eretz Yisrael, when we defend the Jews in Eretz Yisrael, we have to feel that our cause is right. Because if we begin to doubt our cause, if we begin to doubt the righteousness of our case, we will adopt the programs, the attitudes, and become partners of the anti-Semites. And so it is a halacha that we have to know the righteousness of our cause when we go to war. And why does the Torah place it? So the Torah places it in the Torah Shebechsav because the Torah Shebechsav is something that's open for the whole world. In other words, tell this to the world. They might not accept what you say, but the fact that you say it to them will play a role in the perspective that you have. And it's placed before the mitzvahs of the Torah, even though it itself is part of the mitzvah of kibush haaretz, of understanding the righteousness of our cause. In other words, this is a message for those who do not have the mitzvahs of the Torah. It's a message for us to give even to those who do not have the mitzvahs of the Torah. Therefore, Bereshis bara is mentioned before the mitzvahs of the Torah is mentioned. So the purpose of Torah Shebechsav is the purpose of Torah Shebechsav, in a sense, is to reveal to the whole world. Now, when it comes the sale of the buying, the acquiring of the Moras Machpelah for future generations in a separate area, away from the burial sites of the Bnei Ches. That's demonstrative of the fact that Avram's perception and the commitment of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to give Eretz Yisrael to Avram was not one of one generation, of one period of time, but the buying of the burial lot in a separate area was indicative of the eternal possession of Eretz Yisrael by the Jewish people. So, in a sense, it represented, it was acquiring a piece of land. But the acquisition of that piece of land, it wasn't like real estate. It was symbolic. It was fulfillment. It was a symbol of the fulfillment of the commitment of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Avram Avinu, that Eretz Yisrael eternally will be the property, will belong to the Jewish people. And I think, to a certain degree, we could say that that's why the Torah tells us only about only about three couples, about Avram and Sarah, Yitzchak and Rivka, Yaakov and Leah, because the Torah Shebechsav is something that's open to the whole world. When we talk about Eretz Yisrael, we talk about Eretz Yisrael, we do not want them to see Eretz Yisrael from a universalistic standpoint. Yes, we let non-Jews reside in Eretz Yisrael, but Eretz Yisrael, it's not just, as some say, Herzl wanted a land where Jews could live, but Eretz Yisrael has to be a Jewish land. And I think that, but privately, we have to understand that Adam and Chava are buried there. Why is it important to understand why Adam and Chava is buried there? Why is it that we need burial in land, and specifically in Eretz Yisrael? Why is it that way? But the answer is, the reason we need burial in land is because man was created from the earth. God created man. And in a sense, when man is reburied in the earth, it's recognition of the fact that God created man, and God created man to be his partner. And that began with Adam HaRishon. So the necessity for burial is recognition of the source of the creation of man. And man was created b'tselem Elokim, with a neshama, which according to many is a chelik Elokai mimal. And its origin, man, the physical being of man, which the neshama was attached to. And in Adam HaRishon's case, even according to Reb Chaim Volozhiner, the neshama initially was in him. The chelik Elokai mimal was in him. So the burial in the earth is recognition of God's role as the creator and man's role as the agent of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world. And this is very important today, because I remember years ago that when, as I mentioned at the beginning of this year, that when people passed away, even those that weren't religious, that weren't observant, even some of the leaders of Chiloni parties in Eretz Yisrael, those who identified with the communists, but they would stipulate they want the burial in Eretz Yisrael, of course, but kehalacha, in accordance with the Jewish tradition of all the years. And even the conservative and the reform rabbis, when it came to burial, I remember hearing it from conservative reform rabbis that if they didn't do it in the proper way, they would not officiate at those funerals. That the way people were buried, the way people were mourned, tradition played a very big role. It was the experience. Unfortunately, in the last few years, the cremation has become very popular. And many rabbis are not only not fighting it, but they praise it. They officiate at those funerals. They're giving their approval, if not explicitly, implicitly. This is what the Nazis did to the Jewish bodies. This was the biggest disgrace. And now, who has taken over that role of burning the Jewish bodies? Rabbis. Do they think that they're giving honor to the dead? And many people are requesting it. Why? Because it became accepted. Many consider it less of a disgrace than traditional burial. Why? Because it became accepted. So this is the emphasis, and why? Because minhag haYehudim, the custom of the Jewish people, afilu hatov shebehem, even those who are motivated to the limit of their knowledge, keminhag hagoyim asher b'socham hem yoshvim, their attitudes are molded among the nations in whose midst they are. And why is that? Because we're not identifying with the Masorah of the past. And to a certain degree, we're not identifying with the Masorah of the future either. Because what is cremation? Burning. The ultimate destruction. When burial is an identification with our people, it's identification with the Jewish people, with the eternity of the Jewish people. Whether we're buried in Eretz Yisrael, we're buried in Chutz La'aretz. But the Jewish law is you're buried in a Jewish cemetery, because all the Jews come together of all the generations. We're identifying ourselves eternally as part of the Jewish nation. But there are those that do not want to see themselves, do not want to separate themselves from the nations of the world. And because of this, they adopt the practices that have become popular lately, practices that were used by the Nazis to disgrace the Jewish people. And as far as why burial in Eretz Yisrael is a skula, it's a skula because the essence of the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, true, there is a mitzvah in each individual to live in Eretz Yisrael. But if you take a look At the end of Chumash Bamidbar, when the Torah talks about the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, the Torah tells us first, "V'yarashtem asaret v'yashavtem ba." You shall conquer the land, take possession of the land, and that implies hold possession of land. Ki lachem nasatiha, because I gave it to you, lareshes also. So he says, first he says, conquer the land. V'yarashtem ba, conquer, v'yarashtem ba. And you'll live therein. So there's a mitzvah of conquering the land and living there. Why? Because I gave it to you to conquer. So part of the mitzvah, there's a mitzvah of living there. But part of the mitzvah of living there is to live in Eretz Yisrael as a form of conquest. Because when we live in Eretz Yisrael, that helps in Eretz Yisrael being in our possession. It's not just that we're tenants there, but the living in Eretz Yisrael contributes to us being in control or having more control of Eretz Yisrael. And what I see is that burial in Eretz Yisrael reminds us that Eretz Yisrael is not just a piece of real estate that the Jewish people own now, but Eretz Yisrael belongs to the Jewish people eternally. It belonged to them from the time of Avraham Avinu. It belongs to us now, and it will belong to us for the future as well. In a sense, even those who are buried there have an impact on keeping Eretz Yisrael identified as being Jewish eternally, as being the Jewish land from an eternal perspective. And we have to have this attitude. We have to realize we're not fighting just for now. We're fighting for the future, and we're fighting to preserve the past as well. And it's more than just that. I always mention what my uncle Zatzal said about the two vidus, and Yom Kippurim. We say vidui in the silent Shemona Esrei. And my uncle mentioned many questions. I'll try to be short because I know it's getting late. In the silent Shemona Esrei, my uncle mentioned in Europe, when he was in Berlin, he saw Jews would cry in the silent Shemona Esrei in the vidui. But in the Chazaras Hashatz, in the Amidah, when the Chazan would repeat the Shemona Esrei, so the vidui was said in a happy tune. Very strange. And my uncle said that we come as individuals. We don't know. What merits do we have? But we come as the Jewish people. We have the Bris Avos, the covenant of the patriarchs. And the more nation we are, the more we pair as a nation, as a group, I want to suggest the greater our claim to the Bris Avos is. We feel more assured of receiving kapara when we come as a nation. When the Chazan says the vidui, we not only feel assured of kapara, but we could actually, my uncle said, demand kapara. because a bris is a covenant, it's a contract. And no matter how great one party of the contract is, the other party, small as he might be, has a lien on the original party within the limits of the contract. And the contract is to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov exist as part of the Jewish people, as part of the Jewish nation. And our strength as a nation and our identification with the Avos, with the patriarchs, is in Eretz Yisrael, is strongest in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, those who are buried in Eretz Yisrael, they are contributing to the kapara, to the atonement that the Jewish people get from the Bris Havos. In a sense, they are identified with the Mizbeach, with the altar. True, man was created from the earth of the altar, from the earth underneath the spot of the altar. Memakom kaparaso nivra. But in addition, the Jewish people who are buried in Eretz Yisrael are contributing to the kapara, to the greater kapara of the Jewish people, because Eretz Yisrael, identification of Eretz Yisrael as the home, as the eternal home of the Jewish people, gives the Jewish people greater recognition as a nation. Hence, they have a greater kapara on the basis of the Bris Avos. And we have to remember that today, when the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael are being confronted by the enemies. We are struggling. We're struggling for the Jews of this generation, but we're also struggling for the Jews of future generations. And to a certain degree, we're struggling for the Jews of the past generations as well. Okay.
Thank you, Moshe. Just a question.
Sure.
The Legender is of the opinion that man was created in one step with the neshama already in the goal.
Adam Harit, there's a machlokas between the Balatanya and the their prime Volozhina. Not that I understand it, but according to the Balatanya, the neshama hovers over man, but now there are three parts to neshama. There's neshama, actually 5 parts, but we'll limit ourselves to 3 parts. Neshama is the breath of God, the way Reb Chaim Volozhina describes it. It's the breath of God. It comes from the word neshima, as it's figuratively in the mouth of God. And then there is the ruach, which is the neshama going into man. And then there is nefesh, when the neshama rests in man. But the neshama, which is constant in man, constantly going into man from the breath of God. So the neshama is, the way he describes it, it's like someone blowing glass. When one blows glass, so there's breath in the mouth, and that breath goes through a tube and then comes to a rest in the formation of the glass. So the neshama, so he says that the neshama in Adam Arishon, it was a neshama even when it entered into man, it was even entering into man by Adam Arishon. But he says after the sin of the Eitz Hadas, of the tree of knowledge, so then the neshama hovers over man, and it's the ruach and the nefesh that that go into man. The Balatanya says that even today, the neshama enters man, at least at the top, at the head, whereas Reb Chaim Volozhiner says it only hovers over man.
Okay, I think that's it.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Moshe. Yeshikol.
Thank you.
Thank everyone for joining.